going to be talking about the pros and cons of data, as well as the different characteristics of data that we should all be keeping in mind before making strategic decisions. So let's start with the pros of data, or rather the benefits or advantages of data. There are many, but I have summarized them into 2 points. The first one is rather obvious. Data is knowledge. So you can stop the guessing game, you can stop doing guesswork, because with data you have exact information, you have facts, you have figures, statistics, you name it. So there's no more guesswork over there as long as you have data. Also, you can back up your arguments, or let's say you're trying to answer a particular problem, or a question has been raised and you're trying to provide an answer for it. Having data helps you back up your argument. It also helps you make more informed decisions, because you have information that is explaining maybe a concept or a topic or an issue, and with this information you are going to collect different insights that can then guide you in your decision making process. So the first pro of data is that it gives you the knowledge that can help you stop doing a lot of guesswork. You can back up your arguments and you can make more informed decisions. Now let's look at society today. Without data, we would not be able to do meaningful things that will improve people's lives. For instance, because you have data, access to data, you can collect data, you can identify areas where there's an issue or a problem. Let's start there. The second thing you can do is you can understand what's causing this problem. Once you know the cause of the problem, you can find solutions to this problem. And finally, you can predict, or you can prepare for another occurrence of the same problem, or another consequence of this particular problem. For example, with the health industry, without data, we wouldn't have been able to have such advanced technology, machines in hospitals, different medicines that we're using today, even the COVID vaccine, for example. So data gives us knowledge, and with this knowledge, we're able to stop the guesswork, we're able to back up different arguments, we are able to make more informed decisions. And what can we do with this? We can help improve the quality of life in general. Even in marketing departments, we rely on data a lot during the planning stages. Before we come up with a marketing strategy, the most obvious starting point is to collect data, or to analyze data that already exists. So that's the first pro. The second pro is that data is power. In a more literal sense, the world we live in today, if you don't have data, you also don't have power. We've all seen the wars that are happening out there between the likes of Facebook and Google. They're all collecting this data, and because of this data, they're able to create tools or applications, like even social media today. All this data that these owners like Facebook and Google are collecting, it gives them some level of power, because marketers want this information, governments want this information, and without this information, you're kind of forced to either pay for it, fight for it. So it's a form of power in real sense. So that's another pro of having data. In the less dramatic standpoint, having data is power, because you're empowered to make decisions to change people's lives for the better. So it's not just knowledge that you're receiving, you're also getting some sort of power. As a company, for example, when you have enough data and the right data, you're able to do better than your competitors out there. You're able to come up with products that people actually need, or you're able to improve your services. So all this is power, and you get this from having data. Now let's look on the other side of the coin. What are the cons of data? The first one is that data is limited. You can collect so much data, but there will always be a limitation at some point. An obvious limitation would be the duration of that data or the validity of that data. You collected it today, tomorrow it might lose its meaning, or maybe you have data for the last 1 year or the last 5 years, but maybe for a particular issue you need more real-time data, or there are cases where you're collecting data real time, maybe every hour, but then you miss out on information that happened like 10 seconds ago because your data collection method is tied to maybe every hour. So you see there is a limitation at some point, and data is being generated every second. There's data somewhere that's being generated and collected. So there will be a limitation. So that's one of the cons of data. The second con of data is that it is subject to error. Even the most powerful data collection systems or tools, they will require human input at some point. And with human beings managing data, at some point you'll make the wrong decision, or you'll mess up somewhere, or even the way you judge that data, or there will be an error happening at some point. So data is not really 100% perfect. There are so many cases where something has been overlooked or mishandled, data has gone missing or has been corrupted. All these issues will come up because data is not 100% perfect. It is subject to error. There are cases where what psychologists call it availability bias, where you are given data and as you're processing or analyzing that data, you are automatically biased by what you already know, or rather what you can recall, or what makes sense to you. This is very common, for instance, in marketing. You will collect insights from different social media websites, from your own website, from customer care, from, conversations out there. And then when you collect all this data, you will tend to skew that data towards something that works for you. So if you're a product owner, you will tend to look at data differently from somebody who's in sales or somebody who is in marketing, because each of you has an objective and each of you believes in your objective so much that it can bias your judgment. So data is also prone to human error because of availability bias. And then there's the case of acts of God. For example, you are a shop that is close to a road or a highway, and for years you've been collecting data on what are the days you get the highest footfall traffic, what are the days you make the most sales, and you will tie it to things like walk-in customers. So let's say on a particular day where you tend to make the most sales, a tree falls on the road, or there's a breakdown, or for some weird reason people can no longer pass through that road or go through that highway. What will eventually happen? You may not meet your target, your sales target for that day. And what has caused this is something that you have no control over. It's an act of God. A tree fell, or there's floods, or it's, there's storms, it's raining. Like all these things human beings cannot control. Now, if you rely purely on the data that on a particular day I have to hit a certain sales target because that's the day that I get these numbers, you also need to factor in the probability of something happening that's beyond your control. So that's those are the pros and cons of data. Now, let's look at the 4 characteristics of data that we should all keep in mind. And the reason we should keep this in mind is because as we're going about with data collection, analysis, you name it, there are certain factors that we need to understand about data to be able to make the right decisions. Some people call them the 4 V's of data or big data. and I'll list them out. The first one is volume. The second one is variety. The third one is velocity. And lastly, we have veracity. Now, volume, this is where you look at how much data is being collected. So you're a company, you want to make strategic decisions based on data. You need to factor in volume. How much data can you handle? Do you have the right tools? Do you have the right resources? You could be collecting more data than you can handle. So before making a strategic decision around data, you need to understand how much volume you need to collect, how much volume of data you can actually process and store, because those are the three things that a lot of people take for granted. It's not just about having data. You need to plan for how much data you need to collect, how much data you can manage, control, and store. So things like server space, where will this data sit? Will it be in a physical server? Will it be on cloud? You know, there are different vendors out there offering storage solutions like cloud computing. So these are the things that people don't talk about that often, but they're very critical. The second thing is variety. Now, you see, you need to also understand what type of data needs to be collected or analyzed or stored for your company, or what makes sense to you. Variety would mean I want emails, I want phone numbers, I want answers to questions, maybe a questionnaire of, I want audio data like phone calls that have been recorded, or I want video. You also need to understand what types of data you want to collect and the variety that you can collect and handle, and also why you need that particular type of data. In episode 2, part 2 of this episode, I talked about the different types of data. So this is where you also factor in whether you want qualitative data or do you want quantitative data. The third thing is velocity. With velocity, here you look at how frequently this data should be collected. Do you want it real time, like every second? Do you want it daily, weekly, monthly, annually? The list goes on. Frequency is another critical factor that needs to be considered. And lastly, we have veracity. Veracity is when you look at how accurate or applicable this data that you're collecting is. Is it data coming from a credible source? Is this data that you can use to make a very important decision, maybe like a product design decision? Can you launch something confidently based on this data? Or is it just data that's good to know? Also, how applicable is this data? Is this data that will lead to an action, or is it just data that you're collecting for the sake of collecting? So these are the 4 things that everyone should keep in mind when it comes to data: volume, variety, velocity, and veracity. Thank you for tuning in. See you in the next episode.